Welcome to a session where we're going to talk about a new revolution in healthcare. My name is Stephen Locke, and I'm the Chief Medical Officer, founder, and acting CEO of iHope Network. And we're fortunate to have with us a variety of panelists, most of whom have a background in psychiatry or mental health, and who are going to talk about how technology is going to accelerate the integration of behavioral health into general medical care and primary care. And I think all of us are very interested in how that influences the management of chronic illnesses and their potential for a huge adverse impact on health costs. Our panelists today are Kyra Bobinet, Judson Brewer, John Torous, and Arshya Vahabzedeh, and I welcome them to the panel. And they are in the order in which they are in your program on the panel. I'm not going to go through biographies because that's in the program to save time. And what I would like to do, if you feel up to it, would be to ask people on the periphery to move more towards the center so that we can make this more like a natural conversation. And we've been primed to try to do that as a way of enhancing engagement with all of you. I just wanted to make a very brief framing remark before turning it over to our esteemed panelists. And the framing remark has to do with the fact that there is an opportunity to reverse a bad trend in healthcare, which has been the marginalization of behavioral health, facilitated in large part by the development of managed behavioral healthcare organizations and the carving out of mental health services and pulling the care of those patients out of the primary care relationship where they had been for centuries. And what's interesting are two changes, one in technology and one in policy, that have the potential to seriously reverse that in a way that actually can have a tectonic effect on the way we practice healthcare going forward over the next 10 years. And what that is first of all, the democratization of healthcare, the leveling of the playing field, the facilitation of shared decision-making, all of which that can be brought about by the internet and wearable computing and portable computing that is tailored to provide individualized information and decision support tools to patients. The other is the growing trend towards reimbursement for behavioral health and other telemedicine services that can be delivered over the internet, some by clinicians for whom it's a billable service. In Massachusetts, Blue Cross Blue Shield has announced that they will be reimbursing for telemedicine effective January 1st. We are hopeful that other payers, public and private, will follow suit, and that 2016 in Massachusetts will be an opportunity for us to use technology to facilitate the reintegration of behavioral health into primary care. So with that in mind, our first speaker, Kyra Bobinet, has a background in public health, and what makes that unusual is that people who have training in public health oftentimes have an understanding of the value of population health management in ways that people who are trained as individual practitioners who are focusing on the care of the individual patient don't necessarily see. And so my first question is to Kyra, and it has to do with what do you see as the greatest challenges in the development, adoption, and dissemination of interventions for behavioral health as part of a population health management approach in healthcare, and what are the opportunities?
Thank you. So it's great to see this panel. I don't know, my friends are all in the front row here, so thank you very much for showing up, guys. The thing with population health that I have learned that I would share that is kind of a pearl is that it's really just defined separately from individual healthcare as identification, stratification, and intervention matching. so that there's efficient resource management across the entire population. How that relates to behavioral health. When I was a medical director of health and wellness innovation for a very large payer, I got the chance to look at very large company claims data. And some of the patterns that I noticed there was that depression and low back pain and those kinds of things that are kind of either exacerbated by or comorbid with behavioral health issues were in the top 10 always. And for tech companies, it was even higher. It was top 5 usually. And if you segment even the populations within the tech companies, the folks that spent most of their time coding, the engineers, that kind of stuff, they were even higher rates, prevalence. And so from a public health perspective, I think we need the data to be able to be more surgical, if you will, about how to match and intervene. I also think that things like, I had started a workplace wellness program around mind-body stress reduction. And we identified people that had a higher stress level and, correlative to that, they had higher claims data or, claims costs. And post-intervention, we actually saw a significant reduction in those claims costs, even below what they had been, what the baseline was. So there's a really significant opportunity for the masses to get sort of these self-efficacy type programs. Mindfulness is a huge trend right now around that. I like mindfulness because it really puts the control over one's health into one's own mind, into one's own practice, and emphasizes that kind of self-control or self-empowerment around taking it. And it can be delivered over technology. There's a ton of apps. I talked to some chronic pain patients who are using Buddhify, which is a app with like 1 million little meditations on it and guided meditations and that kind of thing. And I think technology can really help to lift and scale some of these newer approaches to self-care, if you will, as well as, and I'm sure my panelists will, my fellow panelists will deal with the sort of higher end of, kind of high tech, and for those that are more high risk and more difficult to treat. I think technology allows us to be more specific about diagnoses and also things that are more difficult to treat at scale.
Thank you. Judd, you have a strong background in the area of the study of mindfulness training and its relevance to the care of patients, and how has your work in that area informed your care of patients in the context of primary care and with extensions into potential implications for public health?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say that I would start by saying my patient care informed the work, which then informed the patient care. That's where I would start. When I was in residency training at Yale, I had been personally meditating all through my MD-PhD program because I was stressed out. And I found that it was helpful for me. And then I noticed working with my patients with addictions that they were actually speaking the same language that I was learning through my meditation practices. And like Kyra's talking about, this is about getting sucked up in cravings and caught up in stuff that they can't control. And so with that, this aha moment happened, and I said, well, maybe we can actually, I can apply my research background to actually study this. And we did some clinical studies first during my residency training, and then I got some NIH funding to study with smoking cessation, for example, where we iteratively, as we went through the protocols, we're learning from the patients who are going through the protocol what was actually useful for them. And our clinical trial turned out very well. We had twice the quit rates of the gold standard treatment, so that was really nice. And then we dove in deeper to look at mechanistically what was going on with them, and we found what the behavioral mechanisms were that were affecting their behavior and how they could change their behavior with mindfulness training. So from those lessons, we were learning, okay, this is helping and how it was helping, and we could turn that into how can we then broaden this, and we could learn the lessons that we were also learning in behavioral health, which is it's hard to train therapists because therapists are good at doing therapy, but they're not great on the average of doing manualized treatment because they want to do therapy. So how can we deliver something that maintains fidelity, has good efficacy, but can be scaled. And that's where we turn to app-based training. So we developed our Craven to Quit app based on the evidence that we had and the mechanism that we had in a way that can be tested and scaled. And it's currently in a couple of clinical trials. NCI is funding one right now, a large 1,200 patient study, et cetera. So I would say we focused on, first on what were our patients saying, and then dove into the mechanism of how mindfulness was helping change their behavior, and then said, okay, how can we scale this with technology?
So what's your strategy for scaling, and how do you enhance engagement and persistence?
A great question. So the strategy for scaling, the nice thing is that technology is advancing rapidly. So we can take our in-person training, we can give videos, we can use animations, we can use in-the-moment exercises, and even tailored quizzes within the app that help ask people, what's actually going on right now, and this is what we would recommend that you do at this point. So those are that's version 1.0. We're now working to figure out how we can incorporate in-the-moment sensing, where there's voice recognition, there are folks out here doing facial recognition, where you can incorporate that, so when people smoke, what do? They look at their phones. So you could actually see what, if they're stressed out, if they're this or that, and then give them tailored treatment based on that. And we're actually testing some of these algorithmically based things with our next vertical, which is going to be eating, stress eating, which is even a larger market.
Is it a commercial product?
The stress eating one? Yeah, we're going to be beta testing this with our partners at UCSF in a couple of weeks.
And what's the marketing strategy? How do you increase your penetration, since that's really, from the public health perspective, the name of the game?
Right. You're asking a scientist about marketing strategy. This is awesome. I said you're asking a scientist about marketing strategy.
Right.
What I can
hang around people who know something about it.
Yeah. So we've got a great CEO that knows this answer. But basically, we can work with payers, we can work with employers, we can even do direct to consumer, because this is something that's easily integratable into platforms that are already available, and then also people can just download it and use it because it's user-friendly.
Right. Well, here's a question that you can easily handle.
Did I sweat
how important is the science to the dissemination?
Well, I thank you for asking that, because I actually think that the science is really, really critical. So maybe back in the 50s, they were designing cancer medications where it was like throwing a hand grenade in your body and you hope that you didn't blow yourself up as much as you blew up the cancer. Well, now you can, there are targeted treatments. You find your tyrosine kinase that's mutated, and you can, Gleevec's a great example of that. You can target that tyrosine kinase mutation, you get a good result, and you get very few side effects. Well, we now know behavioral mechanism of how mindfulness works, so we can target the treatment to that mechanistic pathway so that we get efficacy, and instead of side effects, our CEO coined this term side benefits, because with mindfulness, you start to wake up to your life and actually can enjoy it. Does that get at your question? I think
yes,
it's a great one.
That's good. John, you're a resident, finishing up your residency at the Brigham, is that right?
Yes.
And you have a background in electrical engineering and computer science, right?
It's true.
How many other psychiatrists have you run into in the course of your career who have a background like that?
Not many, but I had parents who were very supportive to put a kid through engineering school and hear him whine, and have a kid go through medical school and also whine and complain. So,
how does that background influence the way you look at psychiatry, the way you look at the way you approach population health, the kinds of tools that you can develop, and the power and levers that it gives you?
I think clearly it's very nice having a background in electrical engineering and computer science, and now doing clinical psychiatry. I see patients, every day except today and weekends. So having a foot in both camps and kind of saying, we know a lot about what technology can do. It can do increasingly more things. We know what psychiatry can do, but how do those two meet in the middle? And I think having a foot in both camps, you can ask the right questions. So you can say, we don't need to hack medicine, hack psychiatry to pieces. Things work really well. And what works really well in technology, and how do we align those up? So one example is a question for you guys: what's the best predictor of treatment response in behavioral health or psychiatry? I'll give you the answer. It's the therapeutic alliance. It's the connection that you have with your doctor, with your treater, with your clinician, or therapist. That therapeutic alliance is very powerful. So then the question for technology is, how can we use technology to support that therapeutic alliance, to make it better, to increase it, not to actually harm it? And there's a lot of ways that technology, you can imagine, can actually hurt that doctor-patient relationship. So I think having a foot in both camps kind of says, what's the right question? What can we do? Another example is being able to code. It was painful to learn, but we actually wanted to do a study at Brigham and Women's. We wanted to have an app that would just ask people some questions that we thought were clinically powerful. And being able to turn an app around very quickly, develop an app, get it through the hospital IRB, because you have a foot in both doors and can answer both questions, was very nice. I said, so we can kind of ask a question, turn it around, produce clinical results, and publish it. Because I think the engineering side and the psychiatry side of me say, whatever we do should be open, we should be transparent, we should be just like Theranos. Sorry, that was a bad joke.
Thanks. And Arshya, you are an innovator at the intersection of primary care and psychiatry. What do you see as the biggest opportunities in that space? And in particular, are there companies that you think are working in that area, or researchers who are turning out clinical trials that demonstrate the effectiveness of specific approaches that merge technology and primary care that really get you interested?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, when we look at primary care and psychiatry, we know that our patients who have behavioral mental health challenges, they're really not being identified or served appropriately by the current mechanisms at play. And what we're seeing is an emergence of companies that are looking to change that. So, for example, we've had Ginger.io that's been around for a while now, but we have new companies like Lyra Health and Valera Health moving in to try and understand how we can optimize the resources that we have in primary care, how we can identify high-risk patients and appropriately triage them so that they get the appropriate resources. Part of that, I think, involves soft touch. So that may not be popular amongst a lot of the tech crowd. I spend a lot of my time on the West Coast now. But the soft touch aspects are actually really important for some of our patients who have the most pertinent behavioral health needs. And those same patients that have the greatest kind of mental health, behavioral health challenges, they tend to actually come with a lot of medical comorbidities. So understanding how we can integrate technology and actually have a human touch to these interactions, whether it's a case manager who steps in after a patient has been identified through data analytics as being higher risk, or potentially some of the predictive analytics that are showing, through either passive data or active data collection, that a patient is deteriorating, whether that's change in sleep, change in their physical activity, or their self-rated scores or scales collected via a variety of devices such as smartphones. I think collecting research is actually extremely important in this. I think that there are a lot of different apps and a lot of different technologies, and a lot of companies are somewhat reluctant to go into the research space. But I think that in order to really help our patients the most, we have to understand some of these technologies aren't hurting our patients, and these technologies are helping to connect our patients better with healthcare providers and ensuring that they're actually improving.
So one of the challenges that companies like iHope face in trying to partner with organizations to do clinical trials has historically been concerns about conflict of interest, or it's been concerns about ownership of intellectual property that might arise from those studies. Several of you are associated with or have been associated with academic institutions and organizations which are also trying to pioneer innovation. What do you see as some of the confounds or complications of working in those environments that influence your ability to work with outside companies that have a profit orientation, but might bring some emerging technology to bear that would be great to work with?
I think that's particularly pertinent because I have my role at Mass General, but I also am head of strategy for a startup called BrainPower, where we build these assistive technologies for children with autism. I think one of the things that we know is that there is a lot of potential in this space to develop technologies that will help our patients. And I think that there is, amongst our academic community and amongst our research community, there is an apprehension sometimes to be involved with commercial organizations. I think also our research models, especially in the academic sector, are too slow for the digital innovations that we're seeing. It takes too long to go through some of the research processes to sometimes get papers peer-reviewed, to get papers published. And I think some of that actually needs to change so that we take technologies, we can construct trials, we can carry them out and report the data and disseminate the data to our colleagues in a much, much faster way. I myself, I'm of the opinion that we need to engage much more actively with commercial companies, commercial entities. There is a risk there, but I think if academia moves too slowly, we'll see more and more companies pushing the direct-to-consumer angle and not going after research or being hesitant to go after research, where really the research is actually quite fundamental to our patients with behavioral health or mental health challenges. I mean, direct-to-consumer is good, but a lot of these patients, especially the ones who are more severe, carry a lot of medical comorbidity. Mm-hmm. And when we think about medicine as well, these patients are connected through the educational system, especially in the case of children, or the social systems. And we need to understand how our technology affects them in all these different aspects, these broad aspects.
I want to take a different tack, which is, I come from Stanford right now, and I had been at Harvard and had been, talking with the licensing office. They're very different, at least when I went through, in terms of how stringent they are. And so I think it varies university by university how much of the pie the institution wants to hold on to. Stanford tends to be pretty liberal, but at the same time, if you have any grant money coming in, if you have anything coming in, they take, the NIH portion, equivalency, even if it's private money. And I think the biggest issue, rather, is the sort of data stores and the data sharing, because data is now considered to be this very hot commodity, even though people don't use all of it or use it. They just want to keep it. They don't want other people to have it. And so I think there's a lot of data hoarding and things like that are more restricting the industry than anything else. And especially when it comes to behavioral health, mental health, the reason why everybody in the room knows that drives most medical cost, and yet the disproportionate funding and disproportionate investment is tilted towards acute care, towards physical body as opposed to mind-body, is because we don't know the data. We don't know how to make those business cases. We don't know how to switch the seesaw in the other direction.
I have a factoid related to that. And even though the CDC for years has said that behavioral factors account for more than 50% of all morbidity and mortality, the proportion of the NIH budget that is allocated towards behavioral sciences research is only 7%. And so that kind of a mismatch addresses policy issues at the highest levels and lack of leadership.
Exactly.
I think from an academic point of view, I'm at Brigham and Women's Hospital right now, and we always are looking for companies to partner with in behavioral health and to kind of drive innovation. But in doing research, we want to see what data the app produces. We want to have the raw data. We don't want there to be a black box. If we're doing clinical research, we want to have the data. We want to understand the data. We want to see where it helps and where it doesn't. And a lot of companies have had the approach that they want to only give you their own metrics. They don't want to show you what's happening. They don't want to open up the black box, and the black box is where the research is. So I think we're finding increasingly now companies are agreeing that we need to open up, we need to be transparent and take a look. Mm-hmm. But at least in prior years, it's been really hard to find people that say, let's work on this together collaboratively. And I think that's changing, and that's a wonderful thing to see changing.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly, I agree with that. And I've seen several attacks. One is, I was doing a bunch of neurofeedback and neuroscience research at Yale, and they just patented all of that stuff and then said, okay, now start a company and we'll help you, So but also with that at UMass, they're very interested in being very partner-oriented because it's a win-win. So they're seeing, okay, we need data, you need data, we all need data with the long view to see what's actually working. Because we know long-term, when we figure out what's actually working, everybody wins, especially our patients.
Exactly. And
so here's a complicating factor in relationship to your point, and that is that for an early stage company, unless you're very well funded, you may not be able to afford what you need to do in order to get a patent. And until you have at least the patent filed, you have to keep a certain amount of what you're doing. You have to protect the best protection for your intellectual property at that point is to keep it secret. And that's at cross purposes with working with an academic institution, which if they're going to do clinical trials, needs to know what it is that you're doing.
I would argue it's even more complex. My brother's a patent lawyer in San Francisco, and he explained to me, it's very hard to patent software or an algorithm in this day and age. So you really, as a company, you have your intellectual property, and that, again, it's not patentable. People can copy it. So I think it's a huge challenge, I think, that we're trying to work at Brigham too, but it's a very good point.
Yeah.
It might be that the very soul of innovation gets stifled when we talk about these long processes like FDA clearance and IP and patent and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not saying that stuff needs to go away, but I think that the disruption is really going to come in the areas where that doesn't exist, which is why there's a proliferation of apps or solutions for readmissions because the money moved there. And so I feel like, move with the herd. We need to create a food source for innovation in behavioral health that then drives that innovation. And then, people are smart, women and men are smart entrepreneurs, scientists, that kind of thing. We'll figure out how to overcome these barriers.
Sure.
I think one of the other things that we've noticed is we want to some of the work we do is with children, and children spend a lot of their time in school settings. Mm-hmm. So one of the areas that we're looking at is how do we do research in schools away from our kind of primary kind of medical establishments, in schools and communities in other more naturalistic settings. And that also kind of challenges some of the more traditional ways of doing research, and that requires the IRB kind of committees to take a much kind of broader view of what they consider as research or a valid way of looking at these issues.
So having gone through a couple IRBs for mental health smartphone apps doing passive data, so collecting GPS, accelerometer data, call logs, it's tricky, but it actually can be done. I think if you can, again, speak a little bit of the technical language, the clinical language, you can move these things through clinical studies. It can happen, and hospitals will approve it. I said, Partners is doing work like this right now. So I think it's daunting sometimes to think of the IRB process and you say, that's the dead end. No one's going to approve this, but it can be done. And I said, Partners is an excellent example where we have a lot of studies in mental health using apps that use a lot of passive data that is invasive in some ways, but I said, the right partnership can get through it.
Do you guys also,
go ahead.
I was going to say, do you guys also feel like, in terms of the spectrum of, severity of symptoms and disease versus kind of the masses who are kind of, have a lot of social anxiety disorders or that kind of thing. I was in a bad mood this morning, right before this panel. I was like, because I got in at 1 a.m., and I didn't get much sleep. And so I had to kind of check myself and be like, I got to pick this up. So, we all struggle with this. Let's just be honest, and that's kind of happening to everybody all the time. But when it comes to just this kind of spectrum, what do you think the business cases are for each of those? And do you think that is what is kind of limiting, having the ability to parse that out on the same level as physical health is parsed out? Because we all know technologies that are wellness technologies. We all know technologies that are pain app technologies or diabetes technologies or those kinds of things. We don't have that same vernacular in mental health and behavioral health, right? And so it gets lumped in. So even on this panel, we're talking about, we haven't talked about the brain implants, but you could talk about brain implants and you could talk about, breathing exercises. It's a big world, and we haven't really parsed it out, right?
Well, I wonder, and maybe I'm not getting at your question directly, but in addictions in particular, you can get at pain points. So you can find, okay, what's their pain point? Are they smoking? Do they want to quit smoking? Are they stress eating and they want to change their stress eating behavior? So I think in that sense, it is very parallel. You know, I have pain, I want to quit smoking, I want to change my eating behavior. So I think there are some that are more well demarcated, and that makes it easier to move forward with those. Whereas others, I completely agree, it's very amorphous. We're still trying to figure out what the definitions of schizophrenia are.
Exactly.
Exactly my point. On that question of the definitions, there's a professor at the School of Biostats at Harvard called J.P. O'Nella, and he coined a term, digital phenotyping. And the idea of digital phenotyping is it's really hard. We have, in psychiatry, there's a book called the DSM that kind of has criteria for how you diagnose an illness. And those criteria haven't changed too much in 100 years. So there's a lot of controversy about that. Perhaps if we had digital phenotyping, if an app can get self-report, if it can bring in some behavioral data, it can now probably bring in some physiological data. Will we kind of get a digital phenotype of what that illness is? And then maybe that's how we link up all the great genetic data we're doing, all the great molecular research, all the great neuroimaging research. And maybe that digital phenotype is where the basic science meets clinical reality, and then we understand the illness better, we have mechanisms, we have treatments that can work. So more research perspective, but another exciting aspect of this conversation.
Yeah,
let me jump in here for a second. First of all, I want to point out that everybody on the panels and heads were bobbing with interest in that point. So I think that captured everybody's imagination. I wanted to open this up and invite the audience to be able to join the conversation. And
Bring it.
It's a little hard for me to see. And do we have a microphone that gets passed around?
There's some mics in the aisles.
Okay, there are mics in, oh yeah, I see the mics in the aisles. Okay, great. So we can take some questions, and what we'll do is while people are thinking about if they'd like to ask a question and have some time to get to the mic if they want to, we can continue.
Yeah. So if I can just riff on that, I think Tom Insel, who is the head of NIMH, has made great strides. Was, right, before he was bought out by Google. So before he went to Google, he really recognized this issue and said, how can we really look at the data to develop these, moving even toward the digital phenotypes? And maybe that's what they'll be doing at Google more of. But I think that's a really nice step in the right direction.
I think the other co-emerging thing is, Emily Finn's work at Yale with the connectome. And, she recently found that, for each one of the brains that are in this room, each of us has kind of a fingerprint of how our brain operates in response to similar stimulus all the time. So as much as we like to think that we're original beings, we're very, very habitual in the way that we respond to things. So every time you prick my finger, ow, I have the same pattern. I have the same neural pattern. So I'm just rutted, beyond belief. So, and so are you. And each of us has our own little kind of creature comfort style that we go to, when we're challenged or when we're trying to process things. And I think that's very intriguing to connect that data up with kind of these treatments and kind of see what the response, you talked about the plasticity, with mindfulness. I think that's just the beginning.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
We have a question over here.
Yes, I'm Mary Beth Schoening from Behavioral Health Innovators, and I get a lot of questions about security, consents being more complex with behavioral health. Have you all thought about solutions to that?
Doing clinical research at the Brigham, I said we have the Brigham iHope. I think this is something that we're pretty used to. We know how to do. It makes sense. So I think if you partner with the right people, it can be done pretty darn easily. But I think it can be a mess if you don't do it correctly.
Right, and I'll add that there's a trend moving toward ways of consenting, especially people with mental disorders, where there's video, there are other ways to engage patients, and then we always give a quiz at the end to make sure they understood what the consent form was. So I agree, if you know how to do it, it's doable, and I think it's going to get even better.
I'm struck by the fact that when I talk to clinicians who are beginning to use telemental health approaches, how many are using Skype or FaceTime without any awareness of the fact that it's not HIPAA compliant,
Yep.
and that there are actually several companies that offer quite inexpensively secure video, which is in which the privacy and confidentiality can be better guaranteed than with ordinary video chat services.
I also found it interesting as a trend that those same engineers that I spoke of, who were the higher prevalence of depression, anxiety, that kind of thing, they were the ones most concerned about confidentiality because they know how easy it is to hack these things and that kind of stuff. So it's kind of like, you know how bad it can get. I think this, because we super identify with our brains as self, and because we are most stigmatized about this area of our health versus other areas of our health, and we guard it very carefully. I think it cannot be understated how much reassurance and making people feel safe and protected in this area should be front and center.
We have another question.
Yeah, Brian Mullen from the Brigham Innovation Hub, but I also have a startup for medical device design, and that's what my PhD was in, looking at products. And the two things with my startup that I noticed, and it's going to the business model question, was funding, both from investment dollars to move these things forward, and if you could talk about that. And then second was the state funding. So a lot of this was, I had innovative products and technologies that wanted to get research done, but we couldn't even find the dollars in schools or the state programs or ways to get the technology that's new into the program, which is actually run by the state, which is run by a subcontractor. So if you could talk a little bit about integration of technology or getting the technology funded either from a service provider standpoint or just funding the company.
Part of that might be some discussion about SBIR or STTR funding that some of you may have had experience with.
And just a note, actually in Massachusetts, there's a bill pending for support funding for innovation in mental health. So you guys can look at that too.
So I can speak a little bit about the SBIR and STTR funding. So and this isn't going to be the case for a lot of people, but I'll just mention it because I think it could be something that for folks to consider. It's really great to get non-dilutive capital through NIH funding. So the Small Business Initiative Research is a pool of money that they have to spend to help small businesses get started. Now, one of the issues there is that you have to have a good research team as part of that, and a lot of what I've seen is there are a lot of startups that don't have that. So they need to find somebody in academia or somebody that has a good research background to partner with to actually do that.
For STTR?
For both of them, SBIR and STTR. And a lot of this, there's a lot of PhD centricism around getting SBIR funding because the people on the review panels are the people with the PhDs and often come from academic institutions. So they're looking for that type of thing because that's what they know, that's what they trust is people that can do research. So I think that's one piece, and also that can support people coming from academia that can come in and say, okay, I want to work with a small company that can move this out into the commercial realm, let's work together. That's what the STTR grants are more aimed toward. But I think your question's a good one, and I hope that states and federal institutions do more things like what you're talking about with Massachusetts that can put this into the hands of folks. But I really think one reason, that's a safeguard, it's really helpful. I'm biased also. I think data are very helpful, and I think research is really helpful, and that's their lens.
We'll get to angels and VCs in a minute, but I wanted to just ask you, what are the downsides to STTR and SBIR funding?
I can mention a little bit about that. The downsides is sometimes it seems like a crapshoot when you're applying for this stuff. So you can have a grant where you've got great pilot data and it seems like a killer grant, and basically your competitors are reviewing it. So it's the model is a little bit, in my experience, it hasn't been great in terms of getting a good fair review process. It's set up, it's supposed to be that way, and that's how NIH really tries to do it. But in my own personal experience, sometimes the reviews seem a little strange.
It can be slow. It could be slower than the funding cycle that you would get if you were going for
that's another big
funding.
downside. It's extremely slow.
Also, what about, is there risk of exposing your IP and in the process of applying?
You can say that, you put very clearly what's confidential. The review panel's not supposed to disclose anything. You trust that people are going to follow those rules. So in theory, there should be very little risk in that.
I think just on that note, that's, I think, one of the reasons, just in terms of getting the scientific expertise on board and getting that funding, I think that's one of the challenges why a lot of neurotechnology companies look towards going towards consumers directly or going towards the wellness, because there's a lot of wearable neurotechnology companies who market directly to the public and often rely on other organizations or academic institutions to step in and say, is this technology going to be helpful for our kind of clinical populations? But the initial steps of the company and the funding routes that they seek are most amenable to a more commercial direct-to-public model.
We do a lot of kind of pro bono work for various startups, and I would say, my image is there's this cave, almost Indiana Jones style, and there's like a jewel at the end on a pedestal with a downlight, and it's called first paid customer. And then all of these skeletons are kind of lining this cave of these startups that couldn't crawl far enough to get to first paid customer. So the configuration that I would suggest the gentleman over here is, I've seen a success pattern around those that partner up with not just payer institutions which are willing to do free pilots, which will not pay you any money but will give you the data. But there's things, in GE and various other venture funds or venture innovation, incubation kind of things with large companies with dollars behind it, that I would say those kind of alignments where you've got somebody who's got, a bank account associated with it, and then they've got distribution channels and relationships that it behooves them to leverage those kinds of things. Qualcomm's one of those, and various other folks. Those are the best sort of areas to get the feeding to the first customer, the sales cycle that's so long in reimbursements and behavioral health and selling to payers and all that kind of stuff. So
we have another question. I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Hi, Steve. I want to thank the panelists for presenting today on this topic. I think
is that David?
This is David. David Ahern. I'm David Ahern. I'm at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. I work with John. I direct the program in behavioral informatics and eHealth. Like Steve, I've been working at this for over 30 years. And I'm very excited about the opportunity with technology, as we've all seen in the startups and wearables. But to the point that, Steve, you made about the policy issues, since we've had a long tradition of carve-out, there's a whole industry that's emerged that's separate from traditional medical care. And how are we going to address that? Because fundamentally, there's lots of dollars at play that have yet to really be brought to bear to really transform behavioral health. And much as I'm involved in lots of these individual projects, I think that's great. But what we need is something that's at a much higher level that really changes the way we view mental health in the United States. And I'm wondering what the panelists think about that. It's really sort of a major challenge that we have to address.
It's an incredibly important question. I think we can contribute to this discussion with the expertise we have.
So I was speaking to, one of the things I mentioned was a few of these different companies who are trying to integrate primary care and behavioral care. And I was actually speaking to one of the founders of Valera Health the other day. And one of the things that he identified as being really critical is actually getting experts in policy on board with their startup. So we have kind of clinical expertise and we have data science, but in this whole mishmash of regulations and who you know and who are your contacts and who can you call to get clarification or to get help, having some policy expertise either on your team or available is pretty critical, and sometimes geo-specific as well, depending on where you're operating.
Let me just quickly add to that we gave a great deal of thought at iHope to who we put on our advisory board, and we took those issues exactly into account. And so we have 2 people who are former medical directors for behavioral health from 2 of the largest insurance payers in Massachusetts. And we have someone who is a former state rep. And I think that the point is that you really need to think strategically around exactly these kinds of issues in building your advisory board, because if you don't have people who are part of your founders team who have that expertise, at the earliest stages of the company, you really need to help, you need to plan strategically with the advice of people who have that expertise.
Well, and I would say that CMS is the bellwether of all medical practice in the United States. So until they shift onto their other foot, it's kind of just chipping away at the iceberg.
I would hope that as these technologies begin to perhaps create more objective evidence for mental health, more perhaps biomarkers would be more scientific word, but things that you can better measure and quantify, I think it'll reduce the stigma around mental health. You'll be able to quantify it, and that may change the way people look at paying for it.
I should perhaps add in that some of the work we do in autism, the actual community that supports people with autism is actually very powerful, and they can themselves institute change at a state or government level. So I think autism in particular, kind of out of mental health and behavioral health, they've done a really, the people in the autism community have done a really great job in terms of changing policy just because they demand it, and they have a much stronger voice than people from our other kind of mental health and behavioral health communities.
How many of you on the panel have had experience speaking with private equity investors, either at the angel level or VCs, about investing in a company with which you've been associated? Okay. So the question I have related to that is, what are the show me questions that you get during a pitch? What do they really want to know? That is the deal breaker or deal maker for that conversation?
I think a very clear business model, revenue model specifically, and go-to-market strategy. And then I would say also just the multiples is the biggest thing. They're not interested in rounding errors, so to speak, especially in Silicon Valley. It's all of these big opportunities, which, again, because of the smaller pond of behavioral health funding, it hasn't really flashed.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would just add to that, especially in behavioral health, because there's a lot of stuff coming out, they want to see data, they want to see clinical efficacy data, because they want to know if your thing actually works as compared to, oh, it looks cool.
Yeah.
Looking cool is good, but working's even better.
So John, you want to add? You look like, either of you.
I think those points are exactly spot on. That's the majority of it. I think there's also, amongst the people who focus on children, autism, and things like that, it's understanding the end user as well. Because some of these people have seen multiple companies pitch, and they may not be sure if those companies may have necessarily spent time with their end users and figuring out, especially with children, like what are the needs of the family and the educational system and these other systems that very much integrate into the health and medical model in these communities.
Yeah, which I think speaks to the advent of design. Apple has the biggest product ever created, right? All based on the intelligence around design. And I think that's slow trickling into healthcare, but the funding is definitely taken a turn the last year, I'd say, to if you don't have good design going into these pitch meetings, if you don't have kind of like, I want to use this, I would want to use this, and everybody else I know would want to use this. We're kind of getting that taste making happening on the funding level too.
One of the reasons for the SBIR and the STTR program had to do with the fact that a lot of translational research around interventions ended up sitting on the shelf and never, even though they may have been clinically effective, never were disseminated and never benefited more than a handful of research subjects. And so part of the reason for a panel like this is to see the transformation of going from translational research to looking at commercial models of dissemination, because my premise has been, I've been running workshops at the American Psychosomatic Society on this subject for about 5 years, has been that without a revenue model and a model that can be supported through commercial success, we will never be able to have a significant public health impact with the kinds of interventions that we're designing that have the potential, because of their scalability, to affect large populations. And so we have to, the clinical researchers really need to partner with people who have the business orientation, and they have to learn how to overcome these apprehension that you've been talking about what it's like to work in a high-powered academic environment when you know that the benefit of your work is going to be dependent upon finding investors. I think we're going to have to strand our last questioner, even though I promised 2 more questions, unless it's a very quick question.
It is a very straightforward question. Rafael Sanchez from Suffolk University. what would you agree as the current trends? It could be like the main 3 trends in behavioral health conditions and patients' compliance. Sorry, diagnosing behavioral health conditions and patients' compliance to treatments.
Well, it's a quick question, but I'm not sure it's a quick answer. I may should have probably worded that differently, but is there someone who can answer that in 30 seconds?
I have one answer, which is behavior change. Everything that could work in clinical research because people are paid to finish these studies or those kinds of things, that's like having a zoo animal. And when you release the zoo animal, can it hunt in the wild is the question. And that means, will people engage with it? Do they want to do this? Do they feel the benefit of it? That kind of thing. Because the adherence, engagement, behavior change, all those things, that's the litmus test of whether these things actually benefit people and actually make a difference.
I would say one word, gamification. It's certainly an interesting way to increase adherence on these technology apps.
And the next time we run a panel like this, we will spend more time talking about gamification, and there'll be a lot more data to look at as well. I want to thank our panelists, and I hope the participants in the audience have found this useful. I thought my mic just went dead. I already got the soft hook, and I don't know what the hard hook is, but turning off the mic would be one. So I think we have to stop here, and the panels will be available for a few minutes if you have individual questions.